Well, thank you for coming along. I'm Gavin Brown. I'm a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Leicester. When Ambrose saw me do a talk for Leicester People's University in the Exchange Bar earlier in the year and lined me up there and then to do a talk for the Human Rights Festival. So I'm very happy to come here and to talk about some research that I've been doing over the last couple of years about the history of British anti-apartheid activism in the late 1980s, and particularly the 4-year-long non-stop picket of the South African embassy during that period. So the title, more or less, that Ambrose gave me was to talk about the lessons that the anti-apartheid non-stop picket might offer for contemporary campaigning around human rights. And so what I want to do today is to give you a little bit of background about the non-stop picket and the international campaign against apartheid, but also to think through 10 potential lessons that campaign may offer to people organising broadly around human rights issues today. So let me give you a bit of background. For nearly 4 years, from the 19th of April 1986, the members and supporters of the City of London Anti-Apartheid Group, who for brevity I'll refer to as City Group for the rest of the talk, not least of all because that's how they describe themselves, for 4 years, nearly 4 years, they maintained a non-stop picket pavement outside the South African embassy in London in Trafalgar Square. A non-stop picket calling for the release of Nelson Mandela. They stayed on that pavement 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, until Nelson Mandela was released from jail. So this is work that I've been working on, research project that I've been working on since 2011 with my colleague Helen Yaffe. It's work funded by the Leverhulme Trust. And both Helen and myself were involved in the non-stop picket in various ways. I joined as a 16-year-old during the summer of 1986 and stayed until the end. And Helen was just a few weeks short of her 8th birthday when the picket began. Her parents had been very involved with City Group since its formation in early 1982. And both her and her sister had attended protests outside the South African embassy throughout their childhood. So in different ways we bring our own experiences of this period of anti-apartheid activism to the research that we've been doing. And that poses all sorts of interesting questions to step outside that experience and think critically about some of that history. To keep the picket going non-stop over that 4-year period, it was organised on a rota, with individuals and groups pledging regular 3 or 6 hour shifts on a weekly basis. But because there was always guaranteed to be someone there, many picketers also turned up whenever they were bored or at a loose end. And picketers came from all walks of life, but the majority of them were under 25 and many were a lot younger, barely into their teens in some instances. Those young people who were university students or unemployed took shifts across the day and across the week, while school students and those in more regular employment tended to fit their shifts in around their other commitments. Saturday afternoons were, perhaps understandably, popular with school students, and perhaps unfairly referred to as the creche occasionally by some of the adults involved in the campaign, because of the large number of young teenagers who congregated on the picket there every Saturday afternoon. So although there was a social element to being on the picket, those teenagers not only took part in the political work of the non-stop picket, but very often took a lead in it too. So it's a campaign in which people of really quite a young age played a significant role. But before I go too much further, I just want to explain a little bit, I'm I'm assuming you probably know, but I want to explain a little bit of the context to apartheid in South Africa and the international campaign against it. And having done that, I'll talk more about the lessons that I think the non-stop picket can offer. So I think it can be tempting at this point in time to reduce apartheid to the expressions of what was known at the time as petty apartheid, the racial segregation of public space, public amenities and services in South Africa. But this was the expression of something deeper. Apartheid was codified in law under the when the Afrikaner National Party came to power in South Africa in 1948. However, the laws they implemented from the early 1950s onwards and the ideological justifications that they gave to white supremacy through a particular reading of Calvinist Protestantism only served to reinforce the legal frameworks that had been implemented by the British during earlier periods of more direct colonial rule. Apartheid, which literally means apartness, was often ideologically justified by its supporters and its apologists as a mechanism for allowing the supposed separate development of different ethnic and racial groups in South Africa. Under the Population Registration Act of 1950, all members of the South African population were racially categorised. And the Group Areas Act of that same year, 1950, was then used to determine and control where different racial groups were allowed to live, particularly in urban areas. And because I'm a geographer, I can't resist having a map. So apartheid was a mechanism for sustaining settler colonialism in South Africa and its next colony of Namibia. It ensured that the white minority of the population, roughly 5 million people, or 15% of the total population of 33 million people in South Africa, continued to live in the nicest areas of the city and owned the majority of the country's land and resources. However, apartheid was also the form that capitalism took in South Africa in the second half of the 20th century. It sustained a highly racialised division of labour, creating a large reserve army of cheap African labour and tightly controlling their access to work in urban areas through the pass laws system. And policing the pass laws and the racial segregation of labour as well as public space in South Africa required a highly securitised society. Acts of civil disobedience and defiance by black and Indian South Africans were often repressed severely. The African National Congress, the ANC, and their allies had been organising campaigns of defiance in opposition to the pass laws and in opposition to the racial segregation of public space through petty apartheid since 1952. But it was the shooting of 69 unarmed protesters organised by the Breakaway Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, on the 21st of March 1960 that served as a tipping point on a number of levels. As a result of events that followed from the Sharpeville massacre, both the ANC and the PAC were banned by the South African government. And both subsequently turned from non-violent civil disobedience and turned to armed struggle as an expression of their opposition to apartheid. The Sharpeville massacre also served to inspire the creation of an anti-apartheid solidarity movement internationally, in Britain, in the Netherlands, in the United States, and elsewhere, in Africa, with various African countries and India as well. In 1966, partly as a result of the lobbying of newly independent African countries, but also some of the Scandinavian countries, apartheid was condemned as a crime against humanity by the United Nations. Sorry, I stepped ahead of myself. Now, I'm mainly going to be talking about protests outside the South African embassy in the mid to late 1980s. But anti-apartheid protesters had been picketing South Africa House in Trafalgar Square since at least the mid-1960s. Here on screen at the moment are members of the Movement for Colonial Freedom protesting opposite the South African Embassy in June 1956. However, I think it's fair to say that until the City of London Anti-Apartheid group started regularly protesting at the embassy in the early 1980s, very often these protests were silent vigils and often quite sedate in their form. In 1960, the British Anti-Apartheid movement was formed. It was a national membership organisation that drew supporters from across the political spectrum, predominantly on the left, but it did include some liberal members of the Conservative Party. The anti-apartheid movement organised its supporters into local branches around the country. Exiled members of the ANC and the South African Communist Party played an important role in the leadership of the anti-apartheid movement, and also in determining its policies, its campaigns, and exactly who ended up as the recipients of its solidarity campaigning. Throughout the 1960s, the ANC, under the exiled leadership of Oliver Tambo, went on a major international diplomatic offensive to position itself as the, quote, sole legitimate representative of the South African people. That position was never entirely successful, and both the United Nations and the Organisation for African Unity recognised both the ANC and the PAC as anti-apartheid liberation movements. But that tension over who could legitimately represent the South African people during the apartheid era gets played out within the British anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. So, central to the story, central to the analysis I want to offer, is the story of the City of London Anti-Apartheid Group. They were formed in 1982 by Norma Kitson, who we can see here. Incidentally, small girl peeking around the corner of the photo is my colleague Helen Yaffe, aged, I guess, about 6. So Norma Kitson formed the City of London Anti-Apartheid Group. She was an exiled member of the South African Communist Party, a supporter of a member of the ANC. And she grew, the group grew out of the Free Steve Kitson campaign. Her son, her husband, the man in the middle of the photo here, had been one of the second high command of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. So after Nelson Mandela and other leaders of the ANC were arrested and imprisoned at the Rivonia farmhouse, or after that raid and their arrest, David Kitson was one of the 4 strong high command that took over that leadership role in the mid-1960s. He was quite quickly arrested and ended up being one of the longest serving white anti-apartheid political prisoners in South Africa. Now, throughout the late 1970s, his son, who's not shown in this photo, although I think comes up on the next slide, Stephen had gone each Christmas to South Africa. The family was based in London by that time, to visit his father in jail. But Christmas 1981, going into 1982, he was detained by the South African authorities because the excuse given was that they believed he was trying to engineer a prison break of David and the other prisoners. More likely that it was simply an act of intimidation. But Norma Kitson, who was a fairly determined woman who didn't take no for an answer, and who herself had been detained and tortured in South Africa in the 1960s, very quickly drew everyone she knew together to campaign for Steve's release. And that was relatively successful in that he was released within about 6 days, under a week. But out of that initial flurry of campaigning for Steve's release, a group of people had come together around Norma Kitson and her daughter Amandla, shown here hugging her father, And out of that grew the City of London Anti-Apartheid Group. Initially, they were recognised as a local branch of the National Anti-Apartheid Movement. In August 1982, on what would have been David's birthday, they launched a campaign to get him and a number of other prisoners moved, well, ultimately released, but in the short term to be moved to more sanitary and healthy conditions in Pretoria High Security Jail. They launched a non-stop picket then of the South African Embassy that lasted for 86 days before David and the other prisoners were indeed moved off death row and moved into better prison conditions. That high-profile campaigning, the act of a continuous protest outside the South African Embassy, attracted a large group of young activists who were coming to anti-racist, to anti-apartheid campaigning, in many cases for the first time. And Norma and a number of her close colleagues and advisors decided to keep going with this. And throughout the early 1980s, the City of London Anti-Apartheid Group regularly, on a weekly basis, picketed the South African Embassy. But that was at the cost of deteriorating relationships between Citigroup and the national anti-apartheid movement, as well as actually tensions between Citigroup and the London-based leaders of the African National Congress. When David Kitson was released in 1984, he was ordered by the ANC and the South African Communist Party to either persuade Citigroup to come into line or to disown them. And he did neither. He and Norma were expelled from the ANC and the South African Communist Party, and the ANC persuaded the leadership of his union, TAS, to withdraw the funding that had been promised for him for a fellowship at Ruskin College, the Trade Union College in Oxford. I think the reasons for this are multiple. I don't really need to go into them. Partly it's because Citigroup was determined that they should offer solidarity to all anti-apartheid tendencies in South Africa, all progressive anti-apartheid tendencies, not just the ANC. But also I think because David had stayed in South Africa and had served time in jail, his prominence perhaps threatened the position of a number of exiled white leaders of the ANC based in London at the time. So there's a whole number of tensions, I think, that play into this. Off the back of this, in 1984, Citigroup was actually expelled from the National Anti-Apartheid Movement for refusing, officially at least, to restrict its activities and its membership to the square mile of the City of London. South African Embassy, the focus for most of that campaigning is in the next door territory of the City of Westminster. So when they launched the non-stop picket, which I'll describe, the second non-stop picket in 1986, which I think becomes one of the most high-profile anti-apartheid campaigns in Britain in the 1980s, they're actually outside the mainstream anti-apartheid movement. Now, the historian Roger Fieldhouse, who wrote the official history of the British anti-apartheid movement, engages with this drama and these tensions quite considerably. But as he says here, I think he's actually quite reflective about it. He suggests that the leadership of the anti-apartheid movement had an almost pathological fear of the militancy and direct action tactics advocated by what it saw as the far left within the anti-apartheid movement. It saw, well, it referred to as CLAG, City of London Anti-Apartheid Group. Interestingly, only the leadership of the anti-apartheid movement and the Metropolitan Police used that name. Citigroup never really did. As he says, some of their tactics were more direct than the anti-apartheid movements, and sometimes he suggests they were violent. I'm not sure I agree with him on that. But the anti-apartheid movement were unwilling to recognise that the vast majority of non-stop picketers felt that their action was more positive than the anti-apartheid movement's, quotes, talking shop. And he recognised that this particularly appealed to younger people. So there's a bit of context to that. But there's also a context in South Africa. In the mid-1980s, the situation in South Africa was really boiling over. There was a state of emergency imposed. The United Democratic Front had been launched as a legal front for the ANC inside the country, and it drew together combined membership of a whole range of church, student, trade union groups that probably numbered somewhere in the region of 3 million people that it could draw on. There was also a revolt in the black townships of South Africa where, for brief moments in time, the South African authorities lost control of small parts of the country. And I think many people felt at that point in the mid-1980s that the end of apartheid was imminent, was just around the corner. So when Norma Kitson proposed in January 1986 that they should launch another non-stop picket to continuously protest outside the South African embassy until Nelson Mandela was released, I don't think she thought it was going to take another 4 years. I think if she had been trying to persuade people that they might be there on a continuous protest for another 4 years, it may never quite have happened. But she and the people around her did indeed build this momentum to keep a non-stop picket going, and it was launched on the 19th of April with a march from Camden Town Hall to Trafalgar Square and the South African Embassy. Now, unfortunately, I did have a little bit of footage of that first day to show you, but the sort of translation of me having produced this PowerPoint on a PC into using a Mac, it's not going to work, but it is online if anyone, on YouTube if anyone wants to Google it. So I want to, having given that introduction, I want to think through 10 lessons that the non-stop picket might offer for today. And the first is choose the right target. Because I think the success and survival of the non-stop picket benefited from the location of the South African Embassy in London. It also actually probably benefited from the fact that that particular stretch of pavement known as Morley's Hill is actually one of the widest pavements in London. So it became harder for the police to justify removing it because you could quite easily maintain in court that it wasn't causing an obstruction. Then, as now, Trafalgar Square was a major tourist destination. It was also a major thoroughfare between the West End and several mainline stations, as well as, at that time, the hub of London's night bus network. So as a result, the non-stop picket was highly visible, and many people who got involved quite literally just stumbled across it by accident. So there's a benefit to where it was located. There was obviously a political reason why it was outside the South African Embassy. It was there to cause embarrassment and aggravation to the South African diplomats, the representatives of apartheid in Britain. But in terms of drawing together a group of activists committed to a long-term political project, it benefited from where that embassy was located. So choose the right target. The second lesson I want to suggest is be ruthlessly well organised. Now the phrase ruthlessly well organised was used, I don't think entirely complimentarily, or entirely as a compliment, by Seamus Milne, now press advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, in an article he wrote at the time in The Guardian. But indeed, the non-stop picket was ruthlessly well organised. As I mentioned earlier, they had a weekly rota. People didn't just randomly turn up there. People pledged to be there at a particular time each week. The picket, and here is the photo that I promised earlier of Steve Kitson, the picket was also highly organised in its running. So on each shift on the picket, one member wore this little red, I promise you it's red, armband, signifying that they were the chief steward for that shift and the prime point of negotiation between the picket and the police. They were there to provide political leadership to that shift, to make sure that people weren't just hanging out there but were actually engaged in political conversations with members of the public. But they were there to take tactical decisions about interactions with the police, and there to ensure that if there was trouble with the police, proper evidence was gathered that could be used in legal defence if cases ended up in court. So in various ways, the picket maintained its presence there because the group was really highly organised. But they wouldn't have survived for 4 years if they were just highly organised. So the third lesson is welcome and encourage participation. Because I think the non-stop picket took great advantage of its location, of the fact that there were lots of people passing by all the time. The non-stop picket didn't just exist to draw attention to the South African embassy and to noisily disrupt its work. It also actively sought to engage people in anti-apartheid campaigning. Central to time spent on the non-stop picket was the act of petitioning, asking passing members of the public to show their support to Nelson Mandela and perhaps to make a donation to those resisting apartheid. But encounters across the petition board often led to invitations to those people who expressed some interest, invitations for them to stay a little while and to join in the picket, or to come back for the next themed rally that the group were organising. The picket was colourful, noisy and exciting. It looked interesting, it was visually stimulating, it often made a lot of sound, there was lots of chanting, lots of singing. And picketers were taught to be welcoming and to be including of new people, to draw them into the group's work. So those who stopped and joined in were welcomed, were chatted to, and were given the tasks so that they felt included. Taught how to petition effectively, asked to hand out leaflets to members of the public, taught the songs and chants. Because the picket was always there, interested people often came back. So throughout the period of the non-stop picket, Citigroup organised open weekly meetings to which all of its supporters were invited. And very often, that entailed groups of more than 100 people who would attend an open organising meeting on a Friday evening for a number of hours before going to the pub. So I think they were open and welcoming, and that encouraged people to take part. So the fourth lesson follows from that, and that's always have an event forthcoming. The commitment to organise a non-stop picket until Nelson Mandela was released, what after its first year could have looked daunting. And indeed there were times, particularly in the last 6 months, when picket did struggle to keep going. But as well as having an open style of organising that encouraged people to get involved, the non-stop picket worked through a variety of rhythms to provide people with events to contribute to and a focus for keeping people involved and recruiting new members. So through and in parallel with the non-stop picket, Citigroup ran a number of more specific campaigns. Each Friday evening there was a themed rally on the picket, during which the protest numbers would grow, often to up to 100 people at a time. And there was seldom longer than 4 to 6 weeks between a more significant protest, either a march and a demonstration to the embassy, or a larger rally on the picket, or very occasionally a large indoor public meeting with a high-profile speaker from South Africa. These events sustained interest, helped more peripheral or geographically dispersed supporters of the group feel part of something larger, and it helped the core activists to feel supported and part of a broader movement. But they also served to draw in new people. So my fifth lesson relates to those larger protests, and that's to be daring. Because very often, during these larger demonstrations and large rallies, there would be some kind of stunt or some kind of direct action. At different times, people blocked the road in front of the embassy, there's a photo of that coming up, chained themselves to the embassy gates, or climbed onto the roof of the National Gallery opposite the picket to hoist the ANC flag or anti-apartheid banners from the roof of the gallery and its flagpole. So here's a sit-down protest in front of the pavement on the first anniversary of the non-stop picket. And previously you'd seen people handcuffed to the embassy gates. These actions served a couple of purposes. They often stood a chance of increasing the publicity gained by the protest. They added some excitement to the atmosphere, and they helped cultivate a political culture that understood the importance of taking direct action as a central part of solidarity campaigning. So this point leads me into my sixth lesson, and that's to disrupt business as normal. Because off the non-stop picket, Citigroup members organised a number of campaigns of direct action to disrupt business as usual in Britain's economic, cultural, sporting and political links with South Africa. So the photo at the top is of a group of protesters trying to stop Zola Budd, the South African runner, from running at an athletics meet in Gateshead, and a banner from the Springbok Reception Committee, which actually is after the end of the non-stop picket, which included a protest here in Leicester, where people tried to stop the South African Springbok rugby team from playing in the UK. The group also regularly had a series of occupations and protests in the South African Airways offices in Trafalgar Square under in Oxford Circus rather, under the campaign slogan, "No rights, no flights." So my seventh lesson then is that the picket organised to defend its right to protest. We know so very early on in the non-stop picket, the South African embassy complained to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office about the noise that the protest was causing. We know this because under Freedom of Information request information, we've seen some of the correspondence that passed between the embassy and diplomats in the Foreign Office. So that early complaint was made by the embassy to the British government. And soon after, the Metropolitan Police began to curtail the picket's use of a megaphone to stop the ways in which it could make noise while the embassy was open. Citigroup fought this on the streets, in the courts and politically. Here's a photo of the Break the Silence protest they had on their 122nd day in, I think that would have been August 1980, yes, 18th of August 1986. Similar battles were fought over where picketers could stand, whether they could place anything at all on the ground while they were there, whether they could accept financial donations from the public, and many more things. The group fought each attempt to restrict their ability to demonstrate effectively and on the terms that they set. And mostly, they won. But they twice had to campaign to defend their very right to protest outside the South African embassy. You may have probably seen this photo circulating on the internet over the last 6 months or so. Twice, the Metropolitan Police attempted to completely ban anti-apartheid protests from outside and in front of the South African embassy. Twice, Citigroup mobilised its members and its supporters to defy that ban and to test its legality in the courts. In 1984, before the non-stop picket started, the South African Embassy Picket campaign organised to defend against the ban on protest that had started during President voters' state visit to the UK in June of that year, and that's the occasion when Jeremy Corbyn was arrested as part of that campaign. But a similar attempt was made during the duration of the non-stop picket. On the 6th of May 1987, which was the day of a whites-only general election in South Africa, Citigroup had planned a major protest outside the embassy that evening. In fact, they had arranged a mock election, giving Londoners the right to vote for Nelson Mandela, to vote for freedom, as they put it. But during that day, unplanned, 3 members of the group took action themselves and threw several gallons of red paint over the front of the embassy, closing it for the day. But that was the excuse that the Metropolitan Police needed to try and ban protests from outside the embassy. That evening, and many days subsequently, volunteer members of the group, led by Norma Kitson and others, crossed so the picket was relocated to the steps of St Martin in the Fields Church, just up the hill. And that evening, and on numerous occasions over the 2 months that followed, groups of protesters crossed the road, either openly or by jumping off buses and various other mechanisms, to try and break the police's ban, knowing that they would be arrested, but knowing that by going to court they could test the legality of that ban. On both occasions, in 1984 and 1987, after a 2-month period, actually more or less 2 months in both instances, they won back the right to continue protesting directly in front of the embassy gates. In 1984, 6 or 7 people actually ended up going to jail as a result of their repeated arrests during that campaign. That didn't quite happen in 1987, but on both occasions, more than 100 people were arrested, breaking those bans. Ultimately, none of those convictions were upheld, or those arrests didn't result in conviction. But this leads me on to my 8th lesson, and that is, if you're going to put people in a position where they are going to risk arrest as part of their campaigning, either because they're taking direct action, engaging in civil disobedience, or simply because of the contentious nature of your protest, then you have to organise to defend your members through the courts as long as it takes. So, Citigroup would organise. There were numerous arrests over the 4 years of the non-stop picket, somewhere in the region, I think, of 600. Less than 10% of those ever resulted in conviction, partly because the group was ruthlessly well organised, as I suggested earlier, but also because the group was very effective in working to organise the emotional and practical and legal support of people who were arrested. They ensured that members were aware of their legal rights and assured that they knew who to contact if they ended up being arrested. But the group would also get people to ring the custody suite or the police station asking after their welfare whenever people had been arrested. They made sure that people stayed at the police station to greet arrestees on their release. They developed good relationships with human rights lawyers in London, who they worked with to run strong political defences in cases that went to court. They were prepared to support people all the way through the legal process, appealing against convictions if necessary. They also understood that legal support was a political act. They were prepared to campaign politically to challenge unlawful or prejudicial behaviour by the police. Particularly in the early days of Picket, in the summer of 1986, there were a number of young women who were sexually assaulted during, or unlawfully strip searched during their arrests. strip searched in front of male police officers quite often. And the group ran a very high profile and public campaign against that at the time. So my 9th lesson is to remember, in a case like the international campaign against apartheid, to remember that solidarity is more than just charity. Unlike the official national anti-apartheid movement, from which it had been expelled or disaffiliated in 1985, Citigroup explicitly linked opposition to apartheid in South Africa with active anti-racism in Britain. They also practiced what they called non-sectarian solidarity. That while the anti-apartheid movement largely just supported the ANC and its allies, Citigroup also supported Pan-Africanists, people from black consciousness traditions, and other prisoners who were overlooked by the mainstream anti-apartheid movement. Citigroup supported all progressive tendencies within the anti-apartheid liberation movement and did not believe that it was the place of a solidarity organisation in Britain to choose between them. From the group's beginnings in 1982, a number of members of a small far-left organisation, the Revolutionary Communist Group, had played a key role in Citigroup's leadership. Citigroup and the Non-Stop Picket was not a front organisation for the RCG. It was never just their puppet, but they did in many ways shape and influence the group's perspectives on anti-apartheid solidarity. As a result, the Non-Stop Picket always understood its solidarity work as more than just a human rights issue. They framed the struggle against apartheid in anti-imperialist terms and sought to mobilise those sections of British society that, from the RCG's perspective at least, they saw as having the least material interest in Britain's continued super-exploitation of the developing, perhaps I should say, underdeveloped world. In March 1987, Citigroup organised its biggest ever demonstration. The participants in the March for Mandela were described by Carol Brickley, the group's convener, in her speech that day as Thatcher's rejects. In many ways they were. The demonstration included contingents of miners from Hatfield, Maine NUM branch, anti-deportation campaigners from the Viraj Mendes Defence Campaign in Manchester and other anti-deportation groups, radical lesbian and gay activists from the Wombourne 12 Defence Campaign, a group of young lesbian and gay activists who had been arrested in a protest against Section 28 of the Local Government Act that year, and students fresh from an anti-apartheid occupation at the London School of Economics. Brought together by the impassioned speeches of Citigroup activists who had undertaken a national speaking tour mobilising for the demonstration, those attending the March for Mandela represented a temporary coalition of those who had been either marginalised, repressed or radicalised by 8 years of Thatcherism. The March for Mandela provided a snapshot of British radical politics in the 1980s and insights, I think, into the flows of reciprocal solidarity that circulated at the time. Now, before I come to my 10th and final lesson, I want to offer three what I think are important caveats. Because however much I want to say that Non-Stop Picket offers potential lessons for contemporary human rights campaigns or international solidarity campaigns, there are a number of crucial ways in which the situation has changed in the last 25 years. The legal framework around protest and public order has changed significantly in the last quarter of a century. This means that police powers to curtail protests have increased, and the risks associated with some of the actions picketers took part in back then are now far greater than the risks perhaps they were prepared to take at the time. Police surveillance technologies and forward intelligence gathering processes have become ubiquitous. And so I suspect that however ruthlessly well organised the non-stop picket was in the past, their successes in court and the low level of convictions, they might not have got away with quite so much if it were happening today. And thirdly, and I think that's why I have these images on screen, as I said at the start, many of the people who took part, who kept the non-stop picket going on a daily and weekly basis, were teenagers, often young teenagers, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, not just 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And I think that changes in the child protection and safeguarding frameworks since Every Child Matters in the late 1990s would make those young people's participation in these protests harder today. I think they would be under increased scrutiny, and that's without even considering the prevent strategy and the debates about young people's radicalisation today. But I think not only would they come under increasing scrutiny, but I think many of the adults who were involved, who were teachers or social workers, would find it far more uncomfortable to stand on that picket alongside teenagers doing some of the things they did at the time. So those are my three caveats. So my final lesson, and it also relates to the involvement of young people, is that one of the reasons so many people stayed involved in the non-stop picket throughout that 4-year period was because they found ways of making serious politics fun. Two examples to give there. This is not a fantastically good photo, but it is from an occupation of South African Airways on South African Women's Day in August, one of the years, probably 1988. And the group were faced with the challenge of how to get a large group of women into the South African Airways offices to take part in their occupation, to take part in their direct action, without getting the security staff at the Airways suspicious. And how to get a group of women of all ages in there at the same time. And they chose to go in as a party of convent girls with a number of nuns. So the teenage women went in, the young women went in dressed as convent girls, the older women went in as nuns, and remarkably, despite the fact that this was August and therefore blatantly in the middle of the school holidays, they got away with it. And a great deal of silliness and humour involved. But finally, because of the time of year we're at, here's a photo of Father Freedom making an appearance on the non-stop picket on Christmas Day 1988. Father Freedom in this instance, Father Freedom appeared on the non-stop picket each Christmas Day throughout its existence, and often played by a former South African political prisoner. In this instance, it was Zwalile KK, who was the chief representative of the Pan-Africanist Congress in London at the time. And so those are the 10 lessons that I want to offer today. I'm really happy to hear your thoughts or to answer any questions that you might have.